The opening bars of Dupré's Prelude in B major, Opus 7, number 1, perhaps his best known work. Good morning, my name's David Leigh. I'm the Artistic Director of Pipeworks, and it's my pleasure to introduce this day of celebration of the life and work of Marcel Dupré, who died 50 years ago today. It's very unsurprising that Dupré followed a musical career. He was born in 1886 in Rouen to Albert and Alice Dupré. Albert was a science graduate who then studied the organ with Alexandre Guilmant, who remained a close friend of the family, and was the organist of the Abbey of Saint-Ouen in Rouen. The extended Dupré family included many other musicians, artists and writers. One forms the impression of a house in which there was always music around. Alice's dowry was a Pleyel grand piano, to which Albert attached a pedal board. Dupré's memoirs, published as Marcel Dupré Raconte in 1972, tell of one of his first memories, that of Widor coming to Rouen to open the new organ in the Abbey. This instrument's widely regarded as the magnum opus of the renowned organ builder Aristide Cavaillé-Coll, who was also a close family friend of the Duprés. Marcel, then aged 4, was entrusted to his nanny for the duration of the concert. This lady was a very pious lady and decided that she must attend benediction. Dupré seized his moment and made for the stairs that he knew led to the organ loft. Thus he was able to watch Widor perform the Symphony Gothique, having given said nanny the slip. Dupré received his first piano lessons from his father. His interest in the organ was further engaged when Albert Dupré ordered a house organ from the Cavaillé-Coll firm in 1895. The 9-year-old would lie in wait for the workmen every morning during its assembly and then observe them at work. A comment to his father that he didn't know whether he wanted to be an organ builder or an organist was met by a rebuff that his lack of facility at maths would rather rule out the former. In common, I suspect, with many young musicians enthralled by the organ, young Marcel thought that he might now put the piano aside somewhat. But no, Albert was adamant. For every 3/4 of an hour at the piano, you must have 1/4 of an hour at the organ. Marcel was himself to appreciate and echo this attitude in later life, commenting that it's impossible to be a better pianist than one is an organist. Alexandre Guilmant was a seminal figure in Dupré's early life. Here is a photo of Guilmant. A photo that looks rather as if it's come from a cigarette card packet, but seems unlikely. Anyway, Guilmant was a great friend of the family, as I've mentioned. In his autobiography, Dupré recounts a trip to Paris, which was a treat on the occasion of his first communion. In addition to the Botanic Gardens and the Eiffel Tower, he asked to see the organs of La Trinité, Saint-Sulpice and Notre-Dame, all notable Cavaillé-Coll instruments, to attend a performance of Die Meistersinger at the opera, and to have lunch at Guilmant's house. Despite a rebuke from his mother that one does not invite oneself to lunch, the lunch clearly did happen. As Guilmant heard him play, Dupré claims that he was made to improvise a fugue. As a result, he studied privately with Guilmant for 10 years, before entering not the organ but the piano class in the Paris Conservatoire. Only after he had obtained his first prize in piano would Guilmant allow him into his organ class. Dupré's career was very nearly ended before it began in January 1906, when he thrust his hand through a glass door. A shard of glass narrowly missed the cubital nerve, which would have ended any prospect of a keyboard career. As it was, after a few months the injury was healed, and in 1907 he entered the organ class of the Paris Conservatoire, again with Guilmant, and obtained a first prize. He was also admitted to Widor's fugue class in the same year, and it's perhaps an illustration of the ferment and the milieu of early 20th century Paris that both Milhaud and Honegger were amongst his classmates. Thus his relationship with Widor began. Here we have a photo of Widor, I think. There, playing what looks like an extremely modest orgue de chœur. This relationship was to prove one of the most significant of Dupré's life. Widor soon invited him to deputise in Saint-Sulpice, where Widor's the titulaire. Widor was immensely well connected in the artistic life of the city and introduced Dupré to many significant figures in the world of the arts, well beyond the organ and music. In 1914, Dupré competed for the Grand Prix de Rome, a prestigious composition competition. A hung jury was resolved in Dupré's favour by Saint-Saëns, the chairman, using his casting vote. However, unfortunately, the outbreak of World War I prevented Dupré from taking up the study in Rome, which was part of the prize. He was disqualified from military service on account of a childhood operation on his right collarbone, and so worked in a hospital pharmacy for 2 years during the First World War. Many of his friends were killed on active service. For example, René Vierne, the brother of Louis, in whose memory the Prelude and Fugue, Opus 7, number 1, is dedicated. Organists may be amused to learn that no less a figure than Widor pronounced these preludes and fugues unplayable. Through Widor, Dupré also became acquainted with Louis Vierne, who in some circles was known as Widor Jr. Here's a picture of Vierne playing the Wanamaker organ in Philadelphia. As we'll see a little bit later, the organ was very substantially enlarged before Dupré played it. Vierne was by then the organist of Notre-Dame Cathedral. The two men established a warm friendship, which led to Dupré deputising for Vierne regularly from 1916 onwards, as the latter attended a clinic abroad for treatment to his eyes. Many of you, I'm sure, will know Vierne suffered from extremely poor eyesight and a number of other medical complaints, and his health was frequently poor. So 5 months' absence from Notre-Dame turned into 5 years, and Dupré was deputising for Vierne that whole time. Alas, during those years, a rift developed between the two men, as Vierne became concerned that Dupré was representing his position with Notre-Dame, particularly in order to promote himself as a concert artist abroad. There was a row about a notice, which we'll see in a few minutes, which describes Dupré as organist at Notre-Dame Cathedral. There was also a hullabaloo about a brass plaque affixed to a new blowing plant, which again I'll talk about a bit later. Tragically, the two men were never reconciled, and only after Vierne's death in 1937 did Dupré permit any of his pupils to play any of Vierne's music to him. This was a real tragedy, particularly as the two men were sufficiently close for Vierne to dedicate his third symphony to Dupré. In 1919, Dupré received a belated invitation to take up the Prix de Rome scholarship and study at the Villa Medici. He was very heavily involved in Notre-Dame, and by that stage also the Paris Conservatoire and his burgeoning concert career. And so, on advice from Widor, he never took up the scholarship. He speaks of it as a lost paradise in his autobiography. In 1919, also 2 days after the Feast of the Assumption, Dupré was visited in the organ loft at Notre-Dame by Claude Johnson, who was a director of the Rolls-Royce Motor Company. Such visits are not uncommon in Paris. I myself have had the privilege of sitting in on Olivier Latry playing a Sunday afternoon Vespers in Notre-Dame. A keen musician, Johnson was very taken with Dupré's liturgical improvising and asked him if he'd be able to write some pieces similar to what he had heard, which Johnson would then arrange at his own expense to be published. The result of this was the Opus 18 collection, the Communion Vespers on Feasts of the Blessed Virgin, which consists of 15 short pieces arranged into 3 groups, all based on chant, which have become enduringly popular. As a result of this meeting, the two men became firm friends, and Johnson was a frequent visitor to the Notre-Dame organ loft. He also paid for the aforementioned electric blower for Notre-Dame. This arose from an unfortunate incident on one of his visits where the men who were blowing the organ decided that they weren't going to blow the organ anymore until they were given more money. So Johnson happily went off, put his hand in his pocket and gave them more money, and the winding was restored. But he was so taken aback that this was still going on that he paid for the installation of completely new electric blowing plant. It was the plaque on this blower that mentioned Dupré as being organist à Notre-Dame, and this caused some consternation to Vierne. Johnson also organised Dupré's first concert in England on the 9th of December 1920 in the Royal Albert Hall. This led to many performances in the Proms, which were then held in the Queen's Hall, which was subsequently destroyed in World War II. And it was at one of these concerts that Dupré's Symphony in G minor for organ and orchestra, which was one of his most substantial and, alas, to this day least performed works, received its premiere. Another London organ with which Dupré was very strongly associated was the Willis III instrument in Westminster Cathedral. He was involved in its planning and premiered his own Symphonie Passion there on the 9th of October 1925. He returned many times to perform there. Irish listeners might be interested to know that he also played in St Patrick's twice, in November 1925 and December 1947. He also gave his support to the rebuilding of the organ in 1963 by the J.W. Walker firm and was quoted in the promotional material. In September 1927, Dupré received a rather unusual invitation to play the house organ of Lord Glentar, who had an estate in Scotland. This was a very substantial four-manual instrument by Harrison's. The most remarkable aspect of this visit, however, was that an express train was made to make an unscheduled stop, thanks to Lord Glentar's influence, in order to pick Dupré up from a remote country station. The 1920s were the decade in which Dupré's reputation as an international virtuoso was firmly established. In addition to frequent visits to the UK, he was first invited to America on Widor's recommendation in November 1921 to play the immense organ in the Wanamaker store. You'll recall the previous photo of Vierne at the Wanamaker console. Now, this is what the organ had grown to by the time Dupré got to it. Now, I'm not absolutely convinced that's work. Forgive me and I will try that again. There we are. So, 6 manuals by this stage and very, very many stops. I couldn't give you an exact total, but on this occasion he improvised a 4-movement symphony on themes supplied by notable New York organists who included Linwood Farnham and Thomas Tertius Noble, best known for his B minor evening canticles, I suppose. The notice for this concert, which I think we can see here, is one of those that upset Vierne so much. You'll see here that Dupré is described as organist at Notre-Dame Cathedral. The following year, Dupré was invited back to the States and played 94 concerts in a coast-to-coast tour. This seems absolutely incredible today, but in the 1920s, recording and broadcast music were very much in their infancy. Many cities did not have orchestras, and often, even in those that did, their concerts were beyond the pockets of many people. So attending organ recitals was one of the very few ways that people could hear live music. As an aside, this of course was the case in Dublin in the 1920s, with Hewson playing concerts to a packed out St Patrick's Cathedral, largely of orchestral transcriptions in that case. Dupré often improvised substantial works in these concerts, and at least 2 of these improvisations were destined to evolve into written compositions. They were the Symphonie Passion and the Chemin de la Croix. In 1939, Dupré undertook a world tour, including a stint in Australia, where he was photographed inspecting the famous 64-foot reed in Sydney Town Hall. Although the voyage home afforded him time to work on his edition of Bach's organ music, the threat of war and the unfortunate loss of his and his wife's luggage on the way home made this a somewhat fraught voyage. He would, however, continue to tour regularly internationally until 1948. In 1925, Dupré bought a house in Meudon, a suburb of Paris, very close to Guillemot's old house, and he was delighted to be able to acquire the latter's house organ. We can see a picture of it here. As you can see, by the time this photo was taken, Dupré has enlarged it very substantially and added a good number of registers. I think it started life as a fairly modest 3-manual instrument with a traditional Cavaillé-Coll console. In 1926, he was placed in charge of the organ class at the Conservatoire, and thus his pedagogic interests really began to come to the fore. He'd already played from memory twice the complete works of J.S. Bach, and as mentioned above, he was to produce an edition of Bach's organ music. This gives many cues to his approach to teaching. Not only is there copious phrasing, articulation, fingering and footing indicated, but a table included which gives the exact manner as to how every mark of articulation and phrasing is to be executed. I think we can see that table there. This specific table is actually taken from the Tombeau de Titulus, but it features in a number of Dupré's publications. Furthermore, we'll see actually the abbreviations at the bottom. He manages to label all of the significant features of every single fugue. This very rigorous, rigid approach, which I suspect was influenced strongly by Widor, who was known for his own rigour, led his pupil, Marie-Claire Alain, to describe Dupré as the most unmusical man that she'd ever met. However, in this position he taught many who were to become significant figures in the next generation of the French organ world, such as Marie-Claire and brother Jean Alain, tragically killed in 1940, of course, Pierre Cochereau, who was to be a successor at Notre-Dame, Jeanne de Messier, who also has an anniversary this year, of course, 100th of her birth, Jean Guillou, Jean Langlais and Olivier Messiaen. Pedagogy is one of a number of strands running through his composed output and published output, as we'll see later. In 1934, at the age of 90, Widor retired from Saint-Sulpice. Many will know the story that Widor told on the day of his retirement, that he'd been appointed temporarily for, I think, 6 months when he first went to Saint-Sulpice. The 6 months passed. Nothing was said by either side, so Widor just remained in the post. So he said on his retirement, I've been the temporary organist of Saint-Sulpice for 63 years. So Widor nominated Dupré as his successor, and Dupré was to hold the post from that point on until his own death. During the Second World War, the Duprés remained at Meudon. A threat of anti-aircraft guns being installed on the roof of the Salle d'Orgue was averted by an appeal to a sympathetic German officer, but sadly the room sustained heavy damage during an air raid in 1942. Mercifully, the organ escaped largely unscathed. During the war, Dupré was acting head of the Paris Conservatoire. A small skeleton team of professors and students made sure that the Conservatoire remained open to ensure that it wasn't requisitioned by the occupying authorities. It was a post to which he would return de jure in 1954, although he was only allowed to remain there for 2 years as he reached the age of 70, which was a compulsory retirement age, in 1956. During the 1950s and 60s, he played markedly fewer concerts than in earlier years. Certainly the coast-to-coast tours and playing 100 concerts at a time were a thing of the past by that stage, but he still undertook engagements, albeit on a less frequent basis. One can sense from the nature of his written compositions during those years as well, as a move away from the virtuosic and symphonic preoccupations of earlier music towards more liturgically focused subject matter, perhaps as more of his attention became focused in his later years on liturgical playing. His last recitals were given in the October of 1970 in Troyes and Tours, the 2177th and 2178th of his career, by his own reckoning. In assessing Dupré's contribution to the organ world, I'm going to dwell principally on his most tangible legacy, his compositions and other publications. Of course, when considering the totality of an output of a figure such as this, it's impossible to do so in isolation. For example, many of the compositions themselves have a strong didactic element. Certainly the case that Dupré's output for organ has suffered from what Jeremy Filsall refers to as a few barnstormers. Most notably, I've already mentioned the Opus 7 Preludes and Fugues, particularly the B major, to a lesser extent the G minor. A few more individual movements have become popular outside the context of their overall works. One thinks particularly of the first movement of the Symphonie Passion, even more so the last movement of Evocation, which we'll discuss presently. Although it's undeniably an arresting and impressive standalone movement, it does lose considerably in musical argument when it's divorced from the whole work. I'd like to suggest there are a number of interlocking factors at work in Dupré's music and attempt to trace a path through the output. The most self-evident characteristic which most would ascribe to Dupré's music is that of extreme virtuosity. There's hardly anything, any such thing as an easy piece of Dupré. Indeed, as I've mentioned above, Widor considered the B major prelude and fugue unplayable, and there are works such as the Des Esquisses, which even today really are pushing the bounds of what's technically feasible. This focus on technique's most evident in the early works, coming to a head in pieces like the Variations sur Noël, opus 20, and the Deuxième Symphonie, which is opus 26. Here's the end, I beg your pardon, of the toccata of the Deuxième Symphonie. That last massive C-sharp major chord giving the St. Patrick's Blowers a run for their money there. Even the Opus 7 Preludes and Fugues, however, another major theme running through Dupré's output is a preoccupation with counterpoint. By choosing to write in the prelude and fugue form, he's perhaps harking back to the Baroque. This was a preoccupation both for Widor and for Guilmont, both of whom were engaged in producing editions of old masters and so forth. His use of counterpoint is often quite traditional and quite formal and quite rigid. His use of harmony, a lot of the time, although the foreground is highly chromatic and or modal, the underlying structural harmony is often really very traditionally articulated. The functional relationship, even in a piece like the Second Symphony, we'll hear in a little while, the swimming chords on the celeste in the first movement are in, I suppose, as close as you can say, F sharp major in the first, in the exposition. They come back to absolutely textbook in C sharp major in the recapitulation, just articulating textbook sonata form. Probably the most contrapuntally involved works, one thinks of the Variations sur Noël, where a number of the variations are canons at various intervals, and then even more so the second set of Preludes and Fugues, the Opus 36 set, which sadly received performance only very rarely. In these, Dupré really sets out to show that he has mastery of absolutely every fugal device imaginable, and every single one, inversion, diminution, augmentation, stretto, etc., etc., is meticulously labelled in the published score, just to ensure that the player realises the contrapuntal ingenuity of the composer. Even in the early works, however, there's yet another strand of interest, that of liturgical music, chants, and more broadly religious theme. Whilst it's the case that the Vespers, Opus 18, were written in response to a very specific request, the Symphonie Passion, Chemin de la Croix, both very substantial pieces with religious themes, the former drawing on plain song and the latter on poetry. Both, of course, as I've previously mentioned, began life as improvisations and concerts. Whilst they're both very technically demanding, there's none of the ostentatious virtuosity of Opus 7 or indeed the variations there. Mention of Chemin de la Croix brings me to another aspect of Dupré's output which is often overlooked, his use of form, and specifically symphonic processes of thematic transformation. This symphonic sweep becomes most apparent in the works of the 1940s, and specifically the three major symphonic poems: Évocation, dedicated to the memory of his father, Psalm 18 to that of his mother, and Vision. I think, as an aside, if one were to try to think of the most obscure major work by Dupré, I think Vision would probably shave it. Very, very seldom played indeed. At the risk of appropriating a quote from Edward Elgar, I think that Dupré maybe did put the very best of himself into Evocation, Psalm 18. Here's an example of this thematic transformation. This hopefully will be the very opening of Evocation. You'll hear a theme in the left hand played on 16 and 8 foot stops, and this is the main theme that generates most of the piece. So two very important motives there. The first, you'll hear that transformed into highly virtuosic allegro in just a second near the end of the first movement. Also, the repeated note figure that you heard, ya-da-dum, ba-da-dum, at the end gets transformed into all sorts of different things. Here's part of the allegro, which happens near the end of the first movement using exactly the same theme. And then we move to the third movement of Evocation. This is a piece that's achieved considerable popularity as a standalone piece. This is the very end of the third movement where we hear the same theme transformed into a toccata-like figuration. It seemed a shame to cut that off before the triumphant conclusion of the movement, and indeed of the whole piece. Often Dupré will, as it were, tag thematic material with a particularly characteristic sound. One of the best examples of this phenomenon is the first movement of the Second Symphony. Here we listen to the very arresting, angular, dotted opening theme on full organ. And whenever that theme returns, you hear exactly the same tone colour. Next, we have a very rapid alternation on a pair of 8 and 4 foot flutes. And finally, a series of swimming chords on the celestes. And so on. Even though the harmonic language of this piece is very sharply angular and modernist, as I've mentioned previously, the underlying structures are really quite traditional. The piece is quite clearly in the key of C sharp minor, and indeed the swimming celeste chords even function as a second subject, clearly articulating a traditional sonata structure. Returning to Evocation, a further example of a theme with a specific registration, as it were, tagging it, occurs near the end of the second movement, where we hear this. This is an extract, incidentally, which features quadruple pedalling. That very distinctive texture, the right hand of the Waymen, left hand playing fast arpeggiated figures on 16/8 flutes, and the pedal playing 3 and 4 note chords. Very, very distinctive oral idea returns during the course of the third movement with exactly the same registration. That's an example of how one misses out on the full impact of the structure of the piece if one plays the third movement in isolation. Although I must confess I've done that myself many times. Another strand running through his output, as I've mentioned several times, is Pedagogy. This is most obvious in the collection de Tombe de Titluze, whose 16 settings of plain song office hymns are designed to ascend in difficulty as one works through the book. Further evidence of the work's pedagogical intent is the meticulous and exhaustive fingering and footing written into the text, and we also get the same table that I've already showed in this publication. Although the title of the work obviously is paying homage to the earliest significant French composer for the organ, Titluze, it's also difficult not to think of the Orgelbuchlein when looking at this collection. The pieces are all about the same length, and many of the techniques of composition, how one handles cantus firmus and so on, are very similar, although obviously the harmony is rather different. A progression from the tombeau is provided by the 24 inventions of greater difficulty and similarly meticulously annotated. For the real gluttons for punishment, there's the deux esquisses, each of which takes a particular problem, repeated notes in the case of the first and octaves in the case of the second. It extends it to the point where it's really at the limits of what's technically feasible. It's probably these pieces, I think, that inspired Dupré's pupil de Messier to compose her six études, which are, if anything, even more demanding. A third esquisse was discovered and published posthumously. Although they have been linked together, I'm not sure that there's any real evidence that Dupré considered the third to be part of the set with the other two. It's a fine piece in its own right, but it doesn't share the same very single-minded focus on a particular individual problem of technique as the other two. In addition to his own music, of course, Dupré published a number of editions of other composers' works. I've already mentioned his Bach edition, which I suppose must be far and away the most notable. There are also editions of Handel, Mozart and Mendelssohn inter alia. Any survey of his didactic publications would also have to include his numerous textbooks on various subjects. There's an organ method textbook on fugue. Most notably, I think, maybe the 2-volume Cours complet d'improvisation à l'orgue. This is a really exhaustive treatise which subjects the student to numerous exercises in keyboard harmony and counterpoint, laying great emphasis on rigour and structure. Dupre's own improvisations often included symphonic movements, indeed whole symphonies, but although they're structurally contrapuntally very complex, their harmony, judging by the few extant examples we have, is surprisingly restrained and surprisingly diatonic by comparison to a lot of the harmony one hears in the written compositions. I muse that maybe one would expect it to be the other way round, that one would try crazy harmony out in one's improvisations, but then maybe it'd be a little more restrained in written composition, but it seems to be the other way round. And I can think of other French organist, improviser, composers for whom that would also be true more recently as well. The final strand in his output really seems to, as I've mentioned before, really seems to come to the fore in his later years, which is that of music which is liturgically related or has a liturgical function or is inspired by a religious theme. Often chant, often employing very strongly modal harmony. Of course, Dupré spent much of his life, week by week, playing at either Notre-Dame or La Sulpice. This strand of musical influence is present throughout his output. For example, the early Vespers, the Symphonie Passion. But it's notable that the weight of influence is very much more towards this particular character after 1948, which was, of course, the year that he ceased touring internationally regularly. Opus 48, the Six Anciens pour le temps de Noël, very strongly hark back to Opus 18, of course. They're very similar in character and length. They're all very brief. Consequent lack of virtuoso showmanship in the later music may be partly why these works are pretty much without exception fairly rarely played. I can think of one example that is an exception to that, which is the Chorale and Fugue, Opus 57. That does enjoy a certain popularity. It's also interesting to note that although in earlier life Dupré composed extensively for other media, there's piano music, chamber music, orchestral works, songs, even two oratorios, but almost every work in his catalogue from Opus 36 onwards is for the organ. Performance practice in Dupré's music throws up a few interesting issues, one of which is the hoary chestnut of composers as their own interpreters. Dupré was obviously still alive during the time in which the recording industry came of age, which I suppose one would arguably say was in the early to mid-1950s. However, by that time he was already in his late 1960s, and we know that he was suffering from arthritis in his hands, so maybe there are inherent risks in regarding any performance of that era of any of his music by him as being completely definitive, and maybe it's not entirely fair to assume that. Of course, there are frequent occasions where the printed registrations in the score don't match what he's actually doing, and I suppose one would have to argue that yeah, if it's his own music, then he has the right to change that. But does that mean that we should all change it as well? Interesting. Mention of instruments brings up another very interesting question. I think one which is understood by many who are under the apprehension that the cavaille-colle sound is the absolutely sine qua non for playing all of Dupré's works. Now, there's little doubt that cavaille-colle and his instruments did play an absolutely central role in Dupré's musical makeup. He grew up with the instruments. Cavaille-colle himself was even a family friend. Of course, Dupré presided at two of his most notable instruments, Sunday by Sunday. However, touring internationally was also an enormous part of Dupré's musical makeup. And I think certainly between the early 1920s and the late 1940s, the instruments that he encountered, particularly in the Anglophone countries, particularly in the USA actually, had a profound effect on him. We've seen already that he equipped his house organ with a fairly primitive, by modern standards, combination system, which must have been quite a kerfuffle to install. This sort of thing was unheard of in France in the 1920s, but was of course already widespread in the UK and USA. Many of the works from the 1920s and 30s also can be shown to have been conceived for American rather than French instruments simply by virtue of the manual and pedal compass that they employ. Most US instruments would have a 61-note manual compass, so it would go up to the high C, whereas the French, the Cavaillé instruments would often stop at the G or the A. Similarly, the pedal board has the extra couple of, and the American instruments has the extra couple of notes at the top, the F sharp and the G, which wouldn't necessarily be there. The Dizzyem Symphony, for example, which we've heard a few excerpts of, makes frequent use of that extended compass, so it's actually quite tricky to adapt it to play. It can be done, but involves multiple octave transpositions to be able to play it on a reduced compass instrument. Of course, even the idea that there's one single Cavaillé sound which sprang absolutely fully formed in Saint-Denis, which is his first major organ, and remained completely immutable until the very late examples like Toulouse and Saint-Ouen in Rouen, where Dupré's father was organist, coincidentally. Of course, that's not the case. There's a clear progression in Cavaillé, as indeed there is in Father Willis's organs. So I think even the registration indications in a lot of the middle period works, the way that he asks for crescendos to be made, diminuendos to be made, does rather seem to suggest that he had in mind an Anglo-American style stop combination system rather than the French ventile system, which still would have been extant in Paris, the Parisian organs that he would have played at the time. There are also various individual tone colours which are asked for in some of these works, which would be readily found. Chimes, for example, in the Cortège Litanie spring to mind. That there would be many American instruments which would have that, but I think really very few French ones. So obviously the French organ world, Cavaillé is the absolute sine qua non, but I think one has to bear in mind that there are other influences at work there as well. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the next few hours of various organists from around Ireland and indeed further afield, offering a selection of music by Dupré. I think we have some de Messier as well. Jean de Messier, of course, one of Dupre's most notable pupils, was born 100 years ago this year, so we mark her anniversary as well. Before I finish, I'd like to mention the sources that I've drawn on. Marcel Dupré's own autobiography, Marcel Dupré Raconte, which was subsequently published in English as Marcel Dupré Recollections. It's a fascinating personal account, quite often moving, and also, I have to say, almost unbelievably self-pleased at times. There are a number of occasions where he says, "Oh, I was playing a concert. In a flash, I decided to improvise a four-movement symphony," or "In a flash, the organ ciphered, and I decided to transpose the whole fugue down a semitone." But there's also a huge wealth of information contained therein. There are two major English language works about Dupré, that of Michael Murray and that of Graham Steed. I'd also like to commend a very recent article. I think the current issue of Organists Review features an article on Dupré's music by Jeremy Filsall, who not only has recorded the complete organ works, but has also written a PhD on the subject. I think Dupré would have approved, as Jeremy is not only an organist but also a concert pianist of international distinction. So I'd like to thank everybody very much for tuning in. I hope that you found some of what's gone before interesting, and I invite you to enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.